the rush to digitize everything definitely has its downsides. And I think people don't realize, what they're missing until it's almost gone. There's a microcosm of that that's happened with books over the past 20 years. And all my friends in tech were like, why are you bothering with printed books? Didn't you get the memo? Like, there's not going to be any need for them. You're going to be able to download them. But I never believed that because I remembered back in my childhood how important it was to me to like look up at the bookshelf and, decide to go pick something, explore something, take a book on.
This week, I'm sharing part of my conversation with Thatcher Wine, who is an entrepreneur, a writer, and a professional book curator. He's probably better known as the founder and CEO of Juniper Books, which is a company specializing in creating custom curated libraries and also designing special edition books. Now, Thatcher has helped to put together the home libraries for celebrities like Gwyneth Paltrow and Shonda Rhimes. He's also written 2 amazing books, the 12 Monotasks, which centers around productivity and the relationship that we have with the tasks in our lives and the work that we do, and also For the Love of Books, which has an amazing cover, by the way, but that book is about the relationship that we have with books and how to curate better home libraries. So in this conversation, you're going to hear us talking about books, but in a way I think that is far more substantial than that might sound on the surface. We talk about the history of books, the role that they've had both within society and also in shaping society and in shaping the relationship that we have with knowledge, and this idea that the act of curating books is something incredibly powerful, specifically curating physical books, and it shapes the knowledge that gets passed on, it shapes the way that we interact with knowledge. There are so many facets and angles of the relationship that we have with books and the roles that books play in our lives. We talk about the lost art of sitting with books. We talk about how technology is reshaping the connection that we have with books and this specific role that books can play at certain foundational moments in our lives, whether early in our lives, whether it's during hard times, whether it's in particular circumstances, that books can play to give us meaning. And this distinction between physical books and books in other formats, that creating a physical instantiation of knowledge, it's not just about the book, but there's so many additional layers that get wrapped in this token, in this thing. So I'm not going to say too much about it. You're going to hear us explaining in far more detail. You're going to hear Thatcher talking about this in a much clearer way. I really enjoyed this. So you can get the full show notes, the transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io. And you can find Thatcher online on Instagram at Thatcher Wine. His personal website is thatcherwine.com. And if you love this episode, please do share it with a friend. And don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps us tremendously to improve the podcast, to know what you love, to do more of it, and to find other listeners just like you. So one question that I thought would be a good place to start is Wikipedia. First of all, it's always a great honor to have a Wikipedia page, I would assume. But your Wikipedia page lists you as a bibliophile. And first of all, I just love that word. It's a word that I don't often see used or used to reference people. It's quite a specific word. I'm interested to know what that means to you. And also, I mean, it's been used in other contexts in reference to you in like newspaper coverage and things like that. But I just wonder what that term means to you.
So at the most basic level, I mean, it's basically a lover of books. And I think the reason we don't hear it so much these days is probably because unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer people that, read and read voraciously and really love the printed book. I'd say now, there's been definitely an uptick in the past couple of years. More and more people are reading. And, over my 23-year career of having a company called Juniper Books, where I'm the founder and CEO, I've tried to bring back a love of books. And one of the ways I've done that, tried to do it, is like by making the physical book compelling and interesting to have in your home. Because you got to compete for people's attention, right? So everybody's watching YouTube and TikTok and Instagram. And, you got to give them an alternative. And I think books are an amazing alternative. And that's why I'm a bibliophile and why I don't think I necessarily need, everybody in the world to be a bibliophile, but I think everybody should read a little bit every week. It's just a really good habit, really helps, calm your mind, learn about the world, develop empathy, understand, stories. And so, yeah, I take that as a compliment to be called a bibliophile.
Sure. I think there is a lot to unpack just even in what you said just now, which I want to get into. I think probably the best place to start is to, let's turn back the wheel of time a bit and go back to Gutenberg and talk about like the origin of the printed book and kind of look through things from that lens and see how things have evolved over time. I think it could be easy to say, for me to start with, it feels like we're at a unique moment right now where people are losing faith in the longevity of books. People are losing their love for books. You very frequently, more and more, you will come across people that will say, I haven't read a book in 10 years. I haven't read a book since I left university or since I left high school. And maybe there's some tangents of that where you could then connect that to AI. You could then connect that to technology. You could connect that to a lot of other trends in society, more people living alone, the busier that we get, et cetera, et cetera. But it is interesting. There's a tension between that because that could be perfectly valid and we can get to that. But also, I think we've been at this point historically multiple times. I dare say in 2001, when you first started Juniper Books, people would have said the exact same thing. People said the same thing to Jeff Bezos when he was starting Amazon. And even far before that, not long after we first got books, people would have said the very same thing. So I think, yeah, let's go back and maybe if you could talk a little bit about where books come from and this idea of this thing, this token that seems precious in some way. And then we can kind of work forwards from there.
Yeah, I mean, the book is a relatively new invention, right? And it's not as new as AI, but 500 years of having the printed book is relatively recent in human history. And before that, when there was written communications, everything had to be hand copied, right? So if you go back a few thousand years, and especially, most people are familiar with like the classical era, Greek and Roman classics, the books that survive to this day from that era, from the Romans and the Greeks, had to be hand copied. And they were generally hand copied like in a monastery, a scriptorium. And they had to be recopied, every 100 years or 200 years, or otherwise the paper disintegrated and the ink disappeared. And that is just amazing to think of historically, like the fact that we have all these great classics from, Cicero to Julius Caesar, and we know about these people and Socrates, is because people did this amazing amount of focused, detailed work, generally in a monastery. And there was it was a duty. It wasn't necessarily a labor of love, but probably for some of them it was. And then, you enter this era in the 1400s where Gutenberg invents the printing press and, things all of a sudden you can have the same copy of, the same book, essentially the same amount of knowledge, information that's disseminated, not just kind of one person at a time, one copy of a book at a time, but, all of a sudden, kind of one to many. And then if you just look at the history over the past 500 years since then, there's really a proliferation of that, like the speed, the velocity at which knowledge is transferred is just, intensifying more and more every single day. And with AI, it's like, we're not even the ones creating the knowledge, right? Some computers creating it and then, sending it out. And that's where you get possibly disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, everything. It's just like, that's why you see these things popping up. And those things, it's all related because those things become tools that help us, supposedly get more done, although I dispute that. And they also, the flip side of that is the distractions. So we rely on them maybe as a crutch. We think they're helping us get more done, but they're really distracting us and they're taking us away from, how people lived a few hundred and a few thousand years ago, which was really, being in the moment, doing one thing at a time, because there was no alternative. And even when somebody was copying a book in a monastery in the 1300s, that was all they were doing, their focused attention. They weren't, listening to their Spotify playlist and, responding to texts and interruptions. I mean, they had their own version of it, but it wasn't nearly as intense as it is today.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is the kind of thing that I get excited about personally, just thinking about the history of some of these things, because I think it is incredibly easy to get caught up in abstractions. And, that's a word I use quite frequently, but I think, very often when we think of today's world, we fail to appreciate the number of abstractions that we're kind of interfacing with reality through. And it can be easy to take a very modern lens and use that to look at everything without fully appreciating that many of the ways in which we interface with the world today are kind of modern luxuries, or, they've been fundamentally changed by just the nature of our modern world itself. And even going back to some of what you were saying, the idea that only a few hundred years ago, it was almost impossible for a piece of knowledge to exist in more than one place at once, apart from it just being vocal or shared by word of mouth. The fact that, the physical instantiation of something, these things only existed in one place at one time. And either you would have to travel vast distances to go and see a thing and to learn about a thing, or if you were a king or someone like that, you could have that person come to you, or you could have something brought to you that you could look at. But if something happened to a particular script or something that had been written on a journey or something like that, then it's gone, it's lost. That's it. And that's particularly why I find it incredible, when we talk about, let's say, the Bible or certain historical documents where at some point in time we say, oh, we found this old piece that's written in Greek or written in Aramaic or something like that. The reason it's specifically meaningful is because most of the things from that point in time, if you have a document on which something was written, that is significant. It actually means something. It's not quite the same as finding a book in an old house, right? Where this could have been the 13,000th print of Alice in Wonderland or something like that, even though that might have some significance today, but it carried even more significance then. And I think this thought takes me in two directions. One, which connects to something you mentioned in your TED Talk, this idea that the books that we choose to print, even today, they mean something. And the idea that the books that we keep tell a story. What was resonating with me from what you talked about, and you can elaborate on it a bit more, is this idea that physical books contain lore. What makes a book special, what makes a book meaningful, is the fact that we've chosen to print it. We've chosen to make the story manifest. It's a physical thing you can hold in your hands. And the act of creating that is like a token. It then interacts with the world. So you might remember where you read this particular book and where you were in time. And as you read it, you might remember the sensation when you got to a particular point in the book where there was this many pages left and you were holding the thicker side in this hand, and maybe you were on a train or something like that. There is a ton of meaning that then can transcend the story itself, that can exist because you have this physical copy of it. And what that made me think of was something that I was talking with someone about on Twitter. I think it was earlier this week. This idea that I think someone shared a piece of AI art, and it was like a video that brought to life some of Van Gogh's paintings. And they were like, look how cool this is. Look how meaningful this is. Can you imagine people still loving the basic paintings that we have a few hundred years from now? And I was like, but hold on. I don't think you even see what you're doing here. Like, I don't think you understand. The only reason this video is significant is because it's Van Gogh's painting. Like, there is lore that's baked into this thing. That's what makes the video cool, is because you're bringing to life something that exists as a physical manifestation. And a part of me thinks that as cool as it might be to have AI art and AI stuff, and we can debate, the usefulness of those things, I don't know if we ever get to the same level of meaning without the lore. The physical, when you think about what makes a book meaningful, what makes a painting meaningful, some of it is in the eye of the beholder. It's about what you interpret and what you feel when you look at the thing, when you interact with the thing. But a big part of it is also from the author's side, and knowing what Van Gogh went through and knowing where he was at a particular point in his life. Oh, he painted this at this stage. He'd just done this. He was going to do that. And these are the things that give the art meaning. So yeah, I'd love to hear how that resonates with you and how that might connect to, some of what you talked about in your TED Talk as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many interesting, overlapping thoughts with, some of my work and my philosophy about books and just, where we are in this present moment in the modern world. We're at this juncture where, and we've been here, for a few decades, but it's intensifying, like where I think it's a good thing that books take up space, when things take up space in our homes, our lives, our minds, when they, maybe cost money, when they require some effort and some initiative to create and to think about. And those forces kind of are on one side, like the traditional way of just like going through life and accumulating knowledge and possessions and moving and, things like that. And then there's like the very digital, abstract counter argument to that, which is like, it'd be better if everything was virtual, from whatever currency to ebooks to information that can just be created in a second, downloaded in a second. You don't have to like think about it. A lot of it's free, supposedly. And I think like those two forces are going to battle it out for a while. And most people don't realize, because the argument's been made, by the big tech companies, especially, there'd be better if you can just put everything in the cloud, and it's lightweight, it's low cost. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to like retain the information if you can just go get it anytime you want. And I think that's a real challenge. I think it's as a potential to like rewire our brains, which I think it already has done to a certain extent. And that there's a real value that like the world that's been created over the past 500 years, starting with the invention of the printed book, going through, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all sorts of social changes, which I think are mostly for the better. But there's a lot of forces battling it out to kind of go back to the old way. But maybe there's some confusion about, what's good and what's bad about the old way that things were done. But, I think that there's a lot of, as a book collector and somebody who, builds libraries for people and encourages people to read more and to have the things they love in their homes, and to a certain extent, like in their social media, right? We make a physical product at Juniper Books, like with the book sets, where like if you love The Wheel of Time, or you love Lord of the Rings, or you love Jane Austen, like put those books behind you in your Zoom background and put them in your social media profile. So there's like a little bit of a hybrid strategy, I think, where you can participate in the modern world. I don't advocate against that. I think we all have to do that. But you can, think a little bit more deeply about the things that matter, and have some appreciation for kind of how we built the society and the structure that we have today that, enables some other possibilities for technological improvements and stuff, but don't necessarily just go all in on all of them just because they're new and shiny.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. I'd love to talk a bit more about the idea of space. You mentioned that the book takes up space, but I think another part that connects to that is also the effort. And there's this idea that books now, part of the reason that you might hear people say they don't want to read, or they don't really read that much, is because it feels effortful. And we've kind of been able to condense information. We talked about the history of information, and you had to travel so far to look at something. You had to copy it out by hand. Mm-hmm. That was a tremendous amount of effort. Then you go from there to, you could print a book and you could have multiple copies of that book, and all you have to do is sit down for a few hours and you can read a book, and that's fantastic. And then we've gone from there to actually now it's digital, it's a blog, and now it's not even a blog, it's actually just a podcast, mm-hmm. or an audio summary that you can listen to in 15 minutes while walking your dog. And so we've kind of abstracted this knowledge a tremendous amount. And now, mm-hmm. in fact, you're actually just listening to a TikTok for 15 seconds in your AirPods, and you get the gist of what the book was about, or something like that. And so people will say that, wow, reading feels arduous. And even for me, I love books. There's some books here in my background, mm-hmm. but taking the time to read a physical book, I was trying to read the White Album by Joan Didion earlier this week. And I was finding, sometimes I have to stand up and sometimes I have to sit down and, change modes a few times, because actually just sitting still for a few hours can be difficult. And I would love to maybe hear some of your thoughts on that. And in particular, as regards, and I think this is where sometimes you get some debate or people have different thoughts, different formats. And there are some people that think there is some superiority to having physical versus digital versus audio. And I know that even in just what you've said now, you've talked a little bit about why physical books might be useful and better in some way. I have a mix of thoughts on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts first, and I'll come back. But I would say, okay, in my mind, I imagine it almost as a pendulum. It's probably like a downwards U shape, where I would say first you have physical books as probably the best resource for a number of reasons. One, because like we mentioned before, the physical instantiation of the book becomes like an artifact that creates new meaning because of the way it interacts with the world. So like you mentioned, it interacts with it's on your shelf. It's something that people can see. It's not just the story that exists, but the physical instantiation of it creates additional meaning in the world around you. It's something you can give to someone. It becomes a gift. It can develop meaning in loads of different ways, memories, etc., etc. Then I'd probably say that the worst is, in my personal opinion, maybe ebooks, even though I read loads, and I can tell you about why I buy ebooks for myself in particular. But yeah, I would say it's hard to connect reading the digital version of the book to any external instantiation. Really, that is just about the text. You just get the thing itself, you get the words, they come from the page into your head, and that's pretty much all that exists for the most part. And then for me personally, I would say audio kind of actually is a step up from that, but it's still probably below a physical book. And the reason, at least for me, is because you can recreate some of that physical instantiation, because I walk around a lot. So I will read while I'm walking. And so I was even thinking, as I was reading this physical copy of the White Album, I tried to look and see if there was an audiobook. There wasn't. But I do like to listen to the audio and walk. And I remember very specifically exactly where I was, where I was listening to Wuthering Heights. I was on, this particular road. I remember the time of year because I knew what the sunlight looked like when it was hitting these trees. I know all of those things. And that reminds me of this one word. They say, "Oh, you perishing monkey." And that was such a funny phrase from the book. And I remember that book because I remember, it connects to all these things in my mind. And I think very similarly, I can connect other books that I've read to other places that I've been in the same way. It's not quite as physical as having a physical book, but at least it's not, I could barely tell you where I was when I read various ebooks. I kind of remember because maybe I'm holding my phone or I'm holding my Kindle, but it's not quite the same. So I'd love to hear, like your thoughts, because I know people differ on those things.
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with your hierarchy, and I'll just make a few extra points. I mean, I do think that there's a difference between information, like whether you need it for work or you just want to know something about Winston Churchill or whatever it may be, and want to either read an ebook or listen to a book about it, and then versus like the experience of reading a printed book. It's just about so much more than the information, the words on the page. And there's a great book called Proust and the Squid. I think Marianne Wolf is the author. It really talks about how like the printed book, the invention of the printed book, like rewired our brains, and how the whole experience of reading a printed book, when we read on paper, we are creating the visuals in our mind and the connections between the characters and the distances between the places, and we're making a mental map. And printed books, and to a certain extent audiobooks, you can do that, but I think studies have generally shown like people's retention levels are pretty much mirror like what you said about the hierarchy. Printed books are the best. People remember the most. The audiobooks are next, and then the ebooks. So if you think about ebooks as just being kind of like short-term information consumption, audiobooks being, I love audiobooks personally because I'm the same way. Like if I'm going on a drive or can't fall asleep or, just want to listen to something to relax, some word I might fall asleep, a printed book in my hands, it's a great way to absorb the information. I think there's like a certain amount of that mental mapping, and a lot of it depends on the narrator, to be honest, and the cadence of the book and the genre. But the things that the printed book do for us just go far beyond like information and entertainment. Like Marianne Wolf says in the book, like they have the potential to rewire our brains, help us like develop new neural connections, and all the things you mentioned about like remembering the printed book, where you were when you read the book, who gave it to you. So printed books, I would definitely put at the top of the pyramid, as you did as well, that they have this ability. It's not just about information and entertainment that you gain from them that you could get from an ebook or a website or a blog, or they're a little bit better than audiobooks, although I love audiobooks too. And, I think they're about not just what's in the books, but the experience of reading them. And like you said, I remember where I was when I bought a book, who gave it to me, especially if there's like a note in there, an inscription, a bookmark from the store, a boarding pass or something, that you used as a bookmark when you were traveling with the book. And all those things are like really important in our lives and kind of help to just cement the experience of reading that book and the information in it, and how maybe how you felt about it too, and how you felt about your life or a relationship or your work at the time. Like I'll have these memories come back all the time. When I see a book on the shelf or I pick it up and I reread it, I'm like, oh, I was working at this company and I didn't like my boss and I was dating this girl and it didn't work out, and all these different things. And I think you don't get that from an ebook, right? Studies have shown that you don't remember either what's in the book or where you were when you download it. It's what device, I had an iPhone 8 when I downloaded, this audiobook. I mean, that doesn't happen the same way. And I think we should, appreciate and celebrate that. And we shouldn't think that that's like a burden. I completely recognize that it is a ton of work to read a book and it takes a lot of time. And I talk in my TED talk about how, when you're standing in front of a wall of books and, people can see the video, you can see I've got a few dozen books behind me. Each one of these books took, let's say, 3 years on average to write. It's a ton of work. So like just looking behind me, that's like 100 years of work, which is amazing. And then it's also a lot of work to think that like each of those books, if I just sat down and read it from cover to cover, I probably wouldn't do that. But who has the attention span to do it? Who has the time to do it these days? But if you did it, let's say it would take 12 hours. Some of these are cookbooks because I'm working on something and as my next book that's about a restaurant my parents owned in New York City. So that's a lot of my research library right now. But novels, you don't have to be a fast reader. Let's say it takes you 3 weeks to like just read a little bit every day to finish it. It's a lot of work and you can only do kind of so many in a year, so many in a lifetime. So I think people, like you were saying, given the options of like doing something really fast that has instant gratification and a little dopamine hit, and maybe you get some information, given the alternative, like reading a book or, writing a book and spending the next 3 years working on that. Those are tough choices, but I think they're good choices. And I think they're really good for our brains. And I think, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think it's like how we made all the improvements that we've made to the world we live in really came from being able to do the work. And it's not going to be done for us by ChatGPT.
I think I've heard you mention that your favorite book is The Catcher in the Rye. Has your favorite book changed at various points in your life, or were there various points at which a certain book might have resonated more than another? And part of the reason I asked that, so let's tie a few bits of your personal lore together here. Growing up around the quilted giraffe, perhaps there's some bits there, and I know you're talking about, some of the research that you're doing now, so I'd love to know if maybe earlier in your life there are particular books that you found resonated with you, or, growing up in that atmosphere, if there was anything in particular that stood out. And then also, Catcher in the Rye, where does that come from? Why? And then also, there's a particular time in your life, first of all, building Juniper Books. I think I'll ask you separately, and I'd love to know a bit more about that journey. But I think there's a particular point where you'd gone through some stuff with your relationship, you'd had a divorce, you'd had cancer at a point, you come back and you kind of have to rebuild the business. And I think there's a specific thing there about working on a business that's about books and caring deeply about books. And I wonder if there's any book in particular that had some meaning or resonance with you at that point in time that might be different for someone else who maybe liked books, but they're not actively working on them. So yeah, I know that's a lot to ask, but I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
I guess the reason I always say Catcher in the Rye is my favorite book is because it was the first book that really inspired me to be a reader, and also kind of gave me an insight into what it was like to be a writer and to have a certain like a voice in the main character of Holden Caulfield. And I identified with the character. I grew up in New York City, and I kind of had those moments of like wandering around New York and, being somewhat disassociated from my parents, as most people who grew up in, a big city might be. So it was just so eye-opening. So I think like, even though, if you looked at like my, 50 years of reading, 40 years of reading history or something, like, there'd be little blips where I would like go off on a tangent and a deep dive into like Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite authors. And, maybe if you asked me at that period, I'd say like, yeah, sure. Cat's Cradle is my favorite novel of that time. But then it would always come back to Catcher in the Rye, just because of that, like, having it set me on the path of being a reader. In the TED Talk I gave, I was holding a copy. My eighth grade copy of Catcher in the Rye, beat up paperback. And I think just the juxtaposition of like that book and its sentimental value and the memories it brings back versus kind of what I do today with all these like, libraries of leather bound books and, books and fancy covers and stuff is kind of interesting. Like that, yes, it's amazing to have a 2-story library with 1,000 books that you can read and like the luxury of time and a chair and a fireplace, to sit down and read them. But like, it doesn't take that. Like it really could just take one book, paperback book that you're reading on the bus in 8th grade to change your life. And that was true for me. And I think as far as like the, very difficult experiences that I went through 7 years ago, I had cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, went through pretty hardcore chemo. At the same time, was going through some other issues, trying to like keep the business going while I was fighting cancer. And then soon afterwards ended up getting divorced. Super stressful time. I don't wish any of those things, on anybody. And I had to go through those 3 things plus a couple others kind of within a 3-year period. Definitely, the chemo wasn't great for my like the attention span. Like people get chemo brain, just like kind of foggy memory. But I definitely tried to keep reading when I could. I remember A Gentleman in Moscow was one of my favorite books at that time, Immortals. And I think just the like isolation and the physical, emotional, psychological challenges that character in that book goes through, like I could really identify with what I was going through at that time, even though it was a different setting. Obviously, I wasn't in Moscow. Maybe I felt like I was. Yeah. And then, a lot of the thought process that I went through at that time, because on the other side of cancer, I was like, I don't feel, I can't get the same things done. I don't have the attention span to, sit there and read. I don't have the time. I need to, be a good parent, work on my business, things like that. And that's when I started developing this philosophy around monotasking and how to do one thing at a time to do everything better. And I looked back kind of at, pre-cancer and like, how was I productive? When was I happy? And, thought of like 12 things that I generally did every day. And how could I like codify giving my full attention to those things, everything from reading to walking, thinking, creating. How could I sort of practice being a more focused person and a more productive person by just doing the things that I love to do every day, not thinking of them as work, not thinking of them as like, I'm going to train to be productive. It's just more like, I'm going to get better sleep. I'm going to like eat without looking at my phone. These things are like kind of contradictory to what, people do in the modern world. You go to a restaurant, anybody who's by themselves, like is generally looking at their phone because you don't want to be bored. God forbid anybody's like bored and doing nothing in this world. Like everybody wants to like be doing something. I don't think that's generally good for our brains, first of all. I also don't think it's good for our ability to pay attention when we need to pay attention, right? We think like we'll just be able to snap back into like, oh, my partner, my kids, or, some work situation needs my full attention. I'll be able to pay attention to it. Like it doesn't really work that way if you've been watching TikTok all day. It's, everyone's like, oh, can't I, sit still, pay attention. It's like, well, maybe if you didn't watch TikTok all day, like, and you actually did things for longer than 15 seconds, then, you develop that muscle that you need to deal with a difficult situation or persist through a physical challenge like cancer or an emotional, relationship challenge. And I think that's part of the difficulty of the world we live in today, that people don't kind of realize the connection between those two things. And then we do need to train more for using those muscles when we need them to be able to call upon them. And, I think in that period when I was writing the book about monotasking, I was doing a lot of reading about healthy habits and wellness and, everything from Atomic Habits to Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. All those books were kind of like pivotal nuggets of information. Would I say it was my favorite book? No, but they're all kind of important in that time period for learning, making changes, personal growth. But then I probably put all those down and then reread Catcher in the Rye.
I also happen to love Catcher in the Rye. But funnily enough, okay, so I was trying to think, as you were saying, why do I love Catcher in the Rye? I guess perhaps quite similar to you, but it also may be very different because I never lived in New York. I've visited a few times, but I think perhaps I just read it at a similarly formative stage of life where you're also quite young and you're kind of coming into your own and getting some independence, and you're reading about a character that's also, wrestling with a lot of those themes, and they might be very different from you in loads of different ways, a different country, different, there's so many differences. I think reading about a young character with such a powerful voice, I think that voice in particular stood out to me, because I don't think I've read a lot of young characters, at least at the time, where it felt so uniquely that the character themselves had a voice, as opposed to the writer had a voice. And I praise and respect the writer because of the book that they wrote, as opposed to this character feels alive and visceral in some way. And funnily enough, one of my favorite books when people ask me now is actually, it's not The Catcher in the Rye, but it's a book called Young Babylon. But when people ask me what that's about, and most people have never heard of it, and there's a good reason why, but I usually say it's like a Chinese Holden Caulfield. So it's a book about someone growing up and coming of age, but actually instead of in New York, they are growing up in industrial China. They're 17, they're having to go work in a saccharin factory, but they're going through a lot of the similar stages of life. They're, finding some young love. They're figuring out how work is going to go for them. And funnily enough, at that time, I read that when I was working in corporate law, and I was very early in my career in that respect. And I was, navigating a lot of similar themes for my own life. And also I'd been to China, I'd worked in China, etc. So there are a lot of reasons why there's some spiritual connection there for me. But it's interesting because that's a book I read as an ebook. And sometimes I think, and I almost wish I read that as a physical book, that particular one, because I could then connect it to more things in my life. And I wonder, maybe this is the question that I'll lead it to, is, do you think that, especially as the world becomes more and more digital, do you think that there's a potential that we'll lose anything by having, in many various ways, like physical tokens of things, like a physical thing that exists in the world that I can point to and use to relive some memories of a time that I had and a place that I was and the things that I experienced, not just from the story itself, like you were pointing out, but just by virtue of having this physical copy of this thing. And I wonder, when you look at a lot of the themes, I write notes by hand. I've got my notebook here, and most people these days, they don't. Maybe they use Apple Notes at the most, if they make any notes at all, and they just type some notes on their phone. People barely even do that. People that are reading things on Kindle, they might not be writing things inside their books. I don't really do that, but people just talk about, I just make some highlights, but you never even go back and revisit those highlights. And there's a sense in which, because of the convenience of our day-to-day lives now, and I guess the extent to which we commodify a lot of these experiences into just things that we do as opposed to things that we experience, I just wonder how much more of the depth of that meaning we might lose in a world where, however long from now, even more, like already now, most books sold are ebooks. That's already a reality. But I think the phone has been wonderful and magical in that it's consolidated a bunch of other previous things that we used to have. You used to have an MP3 player and a notebook and a calendar and a radio. And now you just have one thing. You used to have a camera. Now you just have, you carry the one thing. Right now, people are even talking about, you won't even have a phone. You're going to have a pair of glasses, or you're going to have this little headset thing. And so actually, you're not going to touch much. You're not going to go to the supermarket and buy food. You're going to order it online. It's going to arrive at your house. Loads of these things that I think have some meaning, that the tangible realities of the world that we interact with, a lot of those more and more will disappear. And I just wonder what your thought is on that when we lose some of that meaning. And maybe this will then tie even into some of the reasons why you founded Juniper Books.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer, in things that have a physical presence in our lives, from books to anything really. Just look around your home and just, recognize that, like, it's nice to have a desk and a bookcase and, windows. Like, these things, we take them for granted at a certain point, but there's a physical, spatial relationship we have with them. And maybe if we chose, to buy them or to design them into our houses or build them or whatever, like, it has even more meaning. And yeah, I think, like, the rush to digitize everything definitely has its downsides. And I think people don't realize, what they're missing until it's almost gone. And I think there's a microcosm of that's happened with books over the past 20 years. When I started Juniper Books, all my friends, I was in the tech business before this. I had an online customer service company that didn't work out. And all my friends in tech were like, why are you bothering with printed books? Didn't you get the memo? Like, there's not going to be any need for them, right? You're going to be able to download them. And so why would anybody take up space in their home with printed books? Same information. You can get it. You can get 1,000,000 books, put it on your device and take it on vacation. But I never believed that because I remembered back in my childhood how important it was to me to look up at the bookshelf and, decide to go pick something, explore something, take a book on, Chinese medicine off the shelf. Or going to the library, I don't know how many of your listeners remember going to the library and looking through the card catalog for something, like the physical act of discovering something. And maybe the library had it, maybe they didn't. Maybe you had to wait for them to call it, in transferred from another library. Or, I remember being in college and going into the stacks and going down the aisles in the library, going to look for a book on, Napoleon and World War, whatever, his invasion of Russia or something. And then discovering other books that I didn't even notice in the card catalog. But I was like, oh, yeah, I definitely want to check this out too. And I think nobody has that experience really anymore. Yeah, you can go on Amazon, it says customers like this, also like this, or browse that, or bought that. A lot of that's being kind of, ruined by advertising and, sponsored information to put in front of you now that they know so much about us. Is it really related, or is it just being sold to the highest bidder to get your attention at the right moment? You might discover something, you might not, but it doesn't quite have the same effect of physically seeing it, opening it, and being like, yeah, this is it. I didn't even know this existed and I want this. So, we went through a period in the mid 2010s where I think books started to make a comeback. And it was really twofold. I think people realized they loved the physical object, maybe threefold. And that object actually had some use in, let's say, the Zoom, Instagram economy. You could signal to others who had like-minded interests that you also loved, fill in the blank, Jane Austen, or a genre like sci-fi or dystopian fiction or something. And you could, especially in the pandemic, connect with other people around the world who had a similar interest. And there's some extent in you can go on Reddit and, different groups and Facebook groups or whatever and belong to this and have a discussion about a book. But it's not quite the same as physically seeing it and be like, oh, I love your collection of, I've never seen it in German, whatever. And bonding over that and having a common language that people who maybe are introverts, could talk to each other using. The other thing that happened is that there started to be an explosion of really good writing and storytelling. And there's a shift kind of that's happened in the past few years of people writing in these genres like sci-fi, romance. There's a new one, romantasy, a combination of romance and fantasy that's just exploded. And I think there's this real hunger for stories that are, engaging, that keep your interest, that really make you want to read. And they're different. There's still popularity of the classics like Hemingway and Charles Dickens and stuff, but it's not quite the same sort of fever that people have when they pick up something and they can't put it down. They don't want it to end. They're starving for the next book. Then they want the movie to come out and the show, and they want to talk to their friends all the time, and they want the merchandise. So there's been a real change in the book world since I started, where I have friends now, same friends, 20 years ago, were like, why are you doing this now? They're like, how did you know that books would be popular? I'm like, well, they've been popular for 500 years. I wasn't that worried about it. So they think, I'm a genius for being in the book business. But, it's nice to see that that's come full circle and that there's hope that maybe that would happen with other things. One of the things I was thinking while you were asking the question is people talk about, going to Mars and journey takes, years. And one of the problems is astronauts just going to want to eat food out of a tube. There's the utilitarian, get the nutrition and hydration you need to get there versus the experience of eating. And one of the things that makes us human is our ability to taste and to make choices and to have the experience of sitting down together. And I think that a similar thing to an ebook. It's an ebook is getting food out of a tube versus, sitting down to a meal, which is more equivalent to reading a printed book. At the end of the day, you'll get the whatever you were looking for out of it, but it's just not really the same thing. The same holistic experience.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.